Welcome to The Helping Conversation, an exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of facilitating trusting, safe, inclusive, and effective helping conversations with others. Recorded at RockVox Recording and Production Studios, Rochester, New York. Mouth off at RockVox, rockvox.com. Having enjoyed an almost 40-year career facilitating his own authentic brand of the helping conversation, your host, Executive and Recovery Coach, Keith Greer.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for sitting in with me today on this episode of The Helping Conversation. We have an opportunity today to do a little bit of a recap. A few episodes ago, I did a recap of the first 3 episodes of the season, and I have since had the pleasure and privilege of inviting 3 additional guests into this conversation. And so today we're going to do a little retrospect and talk a little bit about some of the highlights of each of the last 3 episodes, really doing our best to shine a light on the very specific skills that helping people utilize in their work every day. And we had an opportunity over the last 3 episodes to talk with 3 different types of helping people. And there are some things they do a little bit differently. And in the world of helping, there are some aspects of their practice that are very similar. So let's jump in. So in episode 205 of the Helping Conversation, we focused on multicultural education, speaking the truth on history and injustice. And in the studio with us were Dr. Makiti Beck, Dr. Kia Nyami, and Steve Lysenko. And these are 3 folks who all work within the world of public ed, higher ed, and are very invested in the topic of multicultural education and anti-racist education. And they talked eloquently about the long history within our education system. And I can vouch for this as from my experience as a 30-year school social worker of teaching a white version of history, ideas, and models, and that was never questioned. And so we have all been raised, at least in the good old United States culture, with this very specific story of what our history is, and large components of the reality of our history were left out. And what's the cost? What's the cost to our students? What's the cost to our students of color? What's the cost to our students who are white of having learned just this one very limited and narrow version of the history of our country and the history of our society? And so my guests that day talked about concepts like multiple truths. How do we invite people into a place where they can consider multiple truths? And that's true whether we're talking about a large conversation like this, like social inequity, social injustice, systemic racism. And I think of that all the time in the work I do as a coach with individuals, that very often what we're doing in our helping role is creating this space and giving people permission to consider multiple truths. Many people often walk in having operated on one story, one version of either who they are or what their life has been or what they're capable of doing. And one of the greatest gifts that we give as helping folks is we allow them the opportunity to explore further and go deeper. And we use sometimes the term being a possibility thinker. What's the possibilities? What might I be able to do with my life? So my guests talked about that. They talked about the impact of stories on our sense of who we are. And if I have heard a very specific story for a very long time that describes me, well, I come to believe that. And that is true in the larger conversation about social injustice and race. And again, we can bring it down to individuals. I think a lot about my years as a family therapist, where very often that's exactly what I was working with in my office, was people's stories, ingrained stories that had become rigid about who they are, how they are, what we believe is true about the family we came from. And so once again, to be able to give people an opportunity to break out of that rigidness of story and get curious and retell their story, or at least retell or begin to retell what they want the future story to be. One of the more powerful aspects of my conversation with my three guests was, I believe it was Dr. Nyami, who talked about culture as a construct. That there is really, really good evidence that prior to about 300 to 350 years ago, no one talked about culture. Right? It just wasn't, or no one talked about race, and that it was created. It was a construct that was created, and many would say it was a construct that was created to substantiate the story that people who were of the race of people of color were less than. But that you don't find that term anywhere prior to about 300 to 350 years ago. And so can we also look at some of the constructs that guide our life, the things that we believe are true, whether it's about the world, whether it's about society, whether it's about my family, or if it's about me. How do I challenge that? How do I invite some flexibility of thinking into this process so that I give myself the opportunity, along with the helping person I'm working with, to go in whatever direction I might want to go in, especially directions that are different than the direction I have gone in to this point. So what are some of the helping skills that my guests talked about in this episode? Clearly, they talked about very, very deep listening, an honoring type of listening, sitting quietly, withholding judgment, not believing that we know what's right, and listening to people's stories. I've talked about the difference between listening to connect versus listening to understand. And very often in conversation, and this is true even for helping people, we can get a little bit stuck, a little bit reflexive, and move quickly into listening to understand. The person I'm working with is telling me their story, and I take it in and I assign my own meaning to it based on my life experience. And I want to quickly wrap a level of understanding around it so I can kind of put my hands on it. But what we know in the helping world is that as soon as I go there as the helping person, that's impacted my listening. And so what we talk about all the time, and what my guests talked about, especially in this conversation about race and ethnicity, is our need to listen deeply and to listen to connect, to create and hold that safe space where people can take risks and people can be vulnerable. By doing that, by creating that safe space, we invite people to speak their truth. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, one of the greatest gifts that safe space does is it invites possibility into the room. Where might I go? Who might I be? What might I do? What are my goals? What are my capacities? What are the possibilities for my life above and beyond what maybe to this point are the limited possibilities that I felt were in front of me? They talked about another aspect of creating that safe space, which is allowing people to take risks with new behavior. That there is a cost involved in staying the same. There's also benefits to staying the same, but for somebody who is interested in moving forward, there is also a cost for making a change. And so how do we create a space for folks that allows them to kind of do a cost-benefit analysis, so to speak, of an idea they might have or a possibility that they're considering before they start moving towards that? My guest talked quite a bit about the need to be absolutely strength-based. That our conversation, again, especially in the area of race and how the narrative of race in our society has impacted people of color, to invite and support every aspect of conversation that leads to the identification of strength and capacity and positive characteristic and talent and skill and gifts to the world. And in that, they also talked about the power of language. And again, the race is a wonderful example. We have had language build up around our conversations around race and ethnicity and social injustice and systemic racism and police brutality. And the language guides, as Judith Glaser has said, the founder of conversational intelligence, words create worlds. And so to listen to the actual words that people use in describing themselves and their place in the world. Clearly, this conversation around ethnicity and race requires a great deal of empathy, and I would even add to that and maybe say a great deal of courageous empathy, especially on the part of white people. For us to be in this conversation and to be honest and to look at the history, history different than the history that maybe some of us were taught growing up in the public ed system, requires us to be courageous. It requires us to be humble. And it requires us to dig into that very complex helping skill of empathy. My ability to go to an emotional space in the name of connecting with the person I'm working with that is an uncomfortable space for me, maybe a space I'd rather not go to, is a very vulnerable space. But it's in that space that so much connection can take place. And it's in that space where I do believe that for those of you out there like myself who have ever worked with a helping person, those are the moments in that work where we feel we really have a full-fledged, three-dimensional human being in front of us who's not perfect, doesn't have all the answers, but is there with us, right? Is there with us in that space, in that moment when I am experiencing something very painful or deep, and they're willing to go there with me. And again, I always want to remind folks, empathy is not a function of shared experience. Empathy is a function of shared emotion. And so we do not have to have the exact same life experience to meet in an empathic place. We just need to both be able to go to whatever that emotion is. So if the person I'm working with is talking about loss around a very specific experience in their life, I don't need to have had that exact same experience. I just need to go to a place where I experience loss. And the loss and the trauma involved in this conversation around race and social injustice for people of color is astronomical. And so for us helping people, and maybe even more so, especially for us helping people who are white, our ability to go to that empathic place and to be courageous and to listen to the stories and to listen to the hurt and to listen to the trauma and not personalize it and not get defensive is a huge, huge skill. And one of the things I walked away with from this conversation with my colleagues is that in a variety of systems in our society, and I can say public ed, higher ed being among them, as a system, they continue to struggle being willing to have these conversations. They continue to struggle being honest and being candid about the fact that bias exists and racism exists within the system. And again, we talked about this, my three guests and I, about the fact that we can always, always, always differentiate the people in a system from the system. So I can say in my 30 years in public ed, I don't believe I ever worked with anyone who wasn't incredibly committed to their work, wanted the best for kids, wanted the best for the system we worked in, for public education, gave their all, were hard workers, wanted the best. And yet, all of those well-meaning people create a system. And the system has some other aspects of it that push it along. And it's within those aspects in the larger system where it can become difficult to look at our need as a system to change direction. And so I know from my conversation with my colleagues, the conversations they're involved in around multicultural education in public ed and higher ed, that's a challenging conversation because there are many places who are going to say, we don't need to go there. We don't need to go there. It's over. It's done. But I was in a conversation with someone the other day, and we were talking about this, and I found it interesting because the person was proposing a certain perspective here, that why all of a sudden are we making such an issue about race? And can't we just kind of leave it alone and move forward in a really positive way, kind of holding hands and respecting each other? And while I appreciate that take, my response to this person was, for 350 years, at least in our society, race has been a primary conversation, just not talked about directly. And it has been a topic that has been driven by the people that benefited from making it a topic, white people. And so now we're at a point in history where people of color are, and not obviously just most recently, are raising questions and are asking questions and are demanding answers and are demanding equality. And now all of a sudden some of us might say, within us white folk, well, I don't want to talk about this anymore. That's not okay. That is not okay. And from a helping standpoint, it just makes no sense, because if we bring a helping perspective into these larger societal conversations, then we can bring the skills that we use, us helping folk, in our offices, in our rooms, when we're working with people. We can use empathy, and we can use deep listening, and we can use suspending judgment, and we can use being courageous, and we can use our understanding of multiple truths and multiple stories and new possibilities. We can use all of those same concepts in much larger conversations. And so it was really, really a very enjoyable conversation, a very insightful conversation for me, to be there with Dr. Beck and Dr. Nyami and Steve, who are three people who are truly on the forefront of this conversation in my area and beyond, of just simply asking, can we look at whether the story has been true? Can we look at what the damage has been from telling a false story? And can we empower people and support people to tell a new story and to maybe incorporate all of those stories? And so again, for me, the parallels between work on that level, on the society level, on the macro level, and on the micro level, me and a client in my office, the parallels are there, and the skills that we can bring to that conversation to move it forward are the same. The last thing I wanted to say about that episode with my three friends is, and I so appreciate this, and again, this comes maybe from how much of even to this day, my coaching is informed by my years as a family therapist, is to bring a systemic perspective on behavior and change. That when we, and this I think is true, I always find this mindset helpful in my work, that when I am sitting with an individual, I constantly remind myself that this individual does not exist in a vacuum. They exist within a variety of different contexts, a variety of different systems, and they both impact the system and the system impacts them. So whether that's family of origin, whether that's family of procreation, whether that's workplace and colleagues, friends group, that having a systems perspective, that none of us in our lives operate in a vacuum. None of us move forward and achieve the things we achieve just totally based on individual characteristics. It's just not that simple. And if we happen to be a person who has struggled through life in whatever way people might measure that didn't happen just because of us, that there are larger systemic forces at play that just need to be explored. And this becomes another very interesting conversation for me in the helping world. And that's the difference between an explanation and an excuse in our work with folks who are looking to change. Because I often hear, when you bring in that topic of systemic influences that, well, are you giving people excuses? I had a horrible childhood and that's my excuse for why I do what I do, or I'm unhappy at work and that's why I do what I do. And this isn't about excuses, but it is about explanations, because if we do not search for explanations, then we are incredibly limited in what assumptions we will draw about the person and the behavior in front of us. And very often, if you don't look for explanations, larger explanations, then where people tend to go is to a place of judgment. And I see that every day in my work with individuals. They do it to themselves. They show up, and the aspects of their life that are not going well, they assume the story is simply their inadequacy or their inferiority. And they don't look at the larger influences in their life, past, present, and just get curious about, is there a greater explanation here? Looking for explanation and helping people move forward in the change process does not give them excuse, but it can often give them permission to be easier on themselves. It invites them into a broader level of thinking. It's the advantage of using open-ended questions: who, what, where, when, how, what, if, which. It invites an expansive type of thinking and exploration based in curiosity and not in judgment. And so while the topic of social injustice and systemic racism is a wonderful, huge example of looking at the role of the larger system in the impact on individual and how the individual impacts the system, I feel like I'm in that conversation every single day in the work that I do, regardless of the topic that comes in my door, is helping people be curious about the bigger picture. And the bigger picture also could be where people find their strengths and capacities. But the bigger picture can also be where they find the ability to forgive themselves and to see the complexity of their struggles as not just a function of something inherently inferior about them. So I love that. I always have felt that that's one of the gifts that my time in family therapy left with me, is to just constantly in my work as a helping person bounce back and forth between the here and now of the person in front of me and getting curious with them about where they came from and who are some of those people. And so while I don't do this anymore in coaching, well, let me take that back. I kind of do this in my head. I don't write it out the way I used to write it out when I was doing more traditional clinical work. But I would say in my head, I'm drawing a genogram. I'm drawing a family tree and getting curious with people about that part of their lives and the stories from those different systems that they carry with them today, some of which work and move them forward, and some of which do not. I wanted to share a piece of research that I found related to this conversation about multicultural education and bias and racism, and it comes from a woman by the name of Zaretta Hammond. And Zaretta Hammond is an educator and a teacher and an author of a book entitled Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, Promoting Authentic Engagement and Rigor Among Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students. If you look her up, she's got a blog. She has published profusely in this area. And so I found this article by her that I thought was really interesting. The name of the article is Implicit Bias Racist? So it's always interesting, that conversation of what's the difference between bias and racism. So this comes from her article. As human beings, we are not naturally racist, but because of the way our brains are wired, we are naturally groupist. The brain has a strong need for relatedness. The wiring for groupism usually leads the dominant culture, or the in-group, in a race-based society to create out-groups based on race, gender, language, and sexual orientation. A system of inequity is maintained by negative social messages that dehumanize people of color, women, and LGBT people as, quote, the other. For folks in the in group, the brain takes in these messages and downloads them like software into the brain's fear system. This leads to implicit bias, the unconscious attitudes and beliefs that shape our behavior towards someone perceived as inferior or as a threatening outsider. As I read that, I thought quite a bit about my ongoing work in the world of folks who struggle with substance use disorder, because we talk about this all the time with that population. It's another marginalized population, another population where people look at and point that finger of other, less than, inferior, and completely discount, in that case, the fact that folks are struggling with a diagnosable mental illness, but it gets viewed from a more personal and judgmental and moralistic perspective. And so we see them as less. The rest of the article by this author went on to talk about some different ways that we can now respond to be helpful, given what we now understand about some of the neurological basis of what goes on and how quickly bias is created in our amygdala, in our fight or flight system. And one of the suggestions, I guess, that she talks about in her article is trust calms the brain's watchdog. So this article was talking specifically about working with students in an educational setting. And one of the statements that she makes is to be vulnerable and real with students. Share some of your life experience so they see you as human, not just the authority figure, and in return, listen to their stories. And I think, once again, there are great parallels to the work that we do as helping people, in that we can make ourselves vulnerable. We can share pieces of ourselves. We can do some self-disclosure, which again, by the way, I would argue is a very advanced helping skill, to figure out how to do self-disclosure and honor boundaries and know that what I am sharing for the benefit of the person I'm working with and the establishment of our relationship, and not because it makes me feel better, because I'm not there in that role to be taken care of, but that I can do some self-disclosure. I can make myself vulnerable. And then in return, I close my mouth and I listen deeply. And I listen for their stories. And that if we can do that and we can create the trust or generate the trust that comes from doing that, that maybe we can get past some of the bias that walks in the room, or some of the bias that we hold on to ourselves as helping people. In episode 206, I had a wonderful conversation with a woman by the name of Laura Stradley, who is an Army veteran, and she is presently the executive director of the Veterans Outreach Center here in the Rochester area. And one of the things that struck me in our conversation was a stat that I found prior to walking into the room to talk with Laura about her work with our veterans. And the stat was that only 26% of veterans who need services receive services through the Veterans Administration. Right? So only a quarter of all the veterans who need it receive it through this big system called the VA. So 3/4 of our veterans who have physical needs, emotional needs, mental health needs, family needs, aren't winding up at some VA facility. And that's where an organization like the Veterans Outreach Center comes into play. They offer just a nice array of services to veterans and to their families, and have been a real staple in our area for a really long time. The other stat that struck me as Laura and I were talking, or as I got ready to speak with Laura, is that of our, and this is as of 2020, of our entire Department of Defense budget for the United States government, only 35% of those monies are dedicated to veteran services. And I know this can become a bit of a political conversation, and I sure don't want it to be, but I do find it fascinating and sad and worrisome that 65% of the money in the Department of Defense budget goes to waging war, or people would say maybe it goes to preventing war, but only 35% is earmarked to work with the folks who are out there keeping us safe and dealing with the consequences that come of keeping us safe. We need to figure out a way for that ratio to get a little bit more, at least even maybe tilt a little bit more towards our veterans. So our conversation with Laura really focused on not only her work with veterans, but her work as the executive director of this organization, of growing this organization and nurturing this organization at a difficult time in our history, just based on COVID, at a difficult time in our history where funds are short. This is a completely not-for-profit organization. And Laura talked eloquently about her perspective when she walks in the room I think we were talking about her work with veterans at this moment, of her need to engender hope. And I know that to some might sound like a relatively easy thing to do. I would say it's not. A lot of times by the time people show up in front of a helping person, they are steeped in a sense of hopelessness. So it's not easy to engender hope. But I often share the story that many, many years ago, I had a supervisor, again, back when I had a family therapy practice, who always used to tell me that in a 50 to 60 minute family therapy session, you have one goal and one goal only. And that is somewhere in that 50 to 60 minutes, something occurs, something gets said, some interaction happens that in those few seconds engenders a sense of hope in the person or persons you're working with. And she always used to say to me, if you do that, anything else you do in your 50 to 60 minutes is gravy. It's extra. It's wonderful. But it's that sense of hope that is what allows somebody to get up at the end of a helping conversation with you and decide, I'll come back. And again, I think sometimes for those of us who've been in the helping profession for a long time and have found some success in our work, I think it's easy to even minimize that, oh, I meet with somebody and then, yeah, of course they come back, but it's not that simple. It's just not that simple. Because they will not come back unless something occurred in your interaction with them that left them feeling even an iota more hopeful. Hopeful that maybe this is a person who will listen. Hopeful that this is a person who can help me. Hopeful that in our work together, I'm going to move forward. And so I really loved hearing that, and I really want to honor that, and I really want to emphasize that as a true foundational helping skill of keeping a focus on that each time we have a conversation with the people that we work with. Do they walk away feeling more hopeful? Because that means they will come back. They'll make an appointment with you and they'll keep it and they'll be back. Laura also talked about, as my guest did in the previous episode, talked about this concept of creating a safe space, that many veterans come back and they do not trust the helping system. Laura talked quite a bit about her experience in the military and the messages you get in the military about being strong and being indestructible and not needing help, and what it quote means about you if you do need help, especially in the world of needing mental health support and intervention. And so how important it is to quickly in her interaction with veterans create this safe space where people know that they will be listened to. And so I go back to that concept of listening to connect. Laura talked about that in a bunch of different ways. Talked about listening. She talked about listening and not responding. And that doesn't mean not listening. It means listening and not opening your mouth. Right? And just listening. And you know what? I just heard myself use those words. And so let me take a step back here. Because I just said something that we all tend to say in the helping world, and it's something that we need to stop saying. So we have this tendency in the helping world when people talk to us about what we do, and we say, well, we I just listen. And more, I find myself, my back kind of gets stiff at the word just. Because when we put just in front of listen, I just listened, we somehow minimize the act of listening, the skill of listening, and the complexity of listening. And we shouldn't, because it is an amazing skill. It is an amazing gift. I sometimes wonder if you walked up to most human beings and asked them, tell me something you don't have in your life that you would love to have in your life, that if it was there, it would make a world of difference. And the person was at all self-aware and honest, that many, many people would say, I don't really have anyone in my life who listens to me, truly listens to me. Not listens and tries to fix me, not listens and tells me what to do, not listens and then tells me what their aches and pains are. Listens to me. So Laura really drove that home as such an important helping skills with this specific population. Listen, 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 keep your mouth closed, and create create and maintain that safe space. In that, very much related to that, Laura also talked about, while listening and while keeping your mouth closed, that the other thing you were doing is that you are treating the person in the room with you as their own best resource. You trust that in this conversation, they will find their answers. And so it becomes a whole nother reason why, as a helping person, I don't need to open my mouth. I don't need to give suggestions. I don't need to tell people what I think they should do, because people know. But we don't always know if people know if, as the helping person, within 5 minutes into the conversation, we're giving advice and we're telling people what to do and what we think is best. And again, that does not mean that we are not positively motivated. It doesn't mean we're not compassionate, empathic people. It's just, this is just an aspect of the art of helping and building in a little bit of what we understand from the world of change science and the creation of trust and safety through the transaction of conversation. That we listen and we keep our mouth closed and we are patient and we trust that by doing those things, people will discover what their answers are and what their resources are. And how important, again, Laura talked about this, how important that is with this population. And she also, as many of my other guests have talked about that concept of empathy. And again, empathy is a shared emotion, not empathy as a shared experience. Although in her work, this is a place where, and this is neither right, wrong, good or bad, it just is, that many times this specific population of veterans are looking to speak to somebody who is a veteran. And so I can sit here until the cows come home and talk about that shared experience isn't really the issue, shared emotion is. And while I do believe that is the case with empathy, what is much more important, what is paramount, and what trumps anything I think in this would be a veteran walking in and saying, I will feel much more comfortable talking with a veteran. People have a right to do that. When I'm involved in conversations and training coaches and clinicians, and we talk about, could I work with someone of a different ethnic group, culture group, gender group? I'd like to think that we all have the ability to do that. But if that person of a different group walks in and says, I want to work with someone of my group, we need to honor that. That's not a time to argue with them. And so that is, again, one of the benefits of an organization like the Veterans Outreach Center, is that the majority of the people who are working there have been in the service, are veterans, and have first-hand experience with that system and the philosophies of that system that sometimes make it hard for veterans to reach out for services and for help and for support. And then lastly, Laura and I talked a little bit about how all of this is relevant to her role as the executive director. And, you know, what I love about this is the natural carryover of the helping skills we would use in a more traditional, what we might consider a traditional helping conversation. Again, psychologist, social worker, clinician, coach, working maybe in this case with a veteran. And how all of those skills that work in that room, in that helping conversation, carry over into our conversation when we start talking about organizational leadership. That this is still a function of relationship building. This is still a function of trust. This is very much a function of listening and one of the things that is exciting to me in the world of organizational development and leadership is that more and more and more you are reading articles and books that are speaking to the fact that some of the more antiquated philosophies of leadership, tell, sell, yell, convince, coerce, control, they didn't work. They never worked. They never worked well. And that we need to find some other ways to train our leaders in fostering relationships, in fostering groups, in fostering trust with the people that they work with. And so Laura talked about this, engendering trust within her organization, speaking the truth within her organization, which is not only a leadership skill, it's a wonderful coach skill. That coaches speak the truth, that in our work with the individuals, we're willing to be honest with them about what we see, about what we're hearing. We're willing to be honest in those moments when we might challenge someone we're working with to, is what I just heard what you're really saying? I'm hearing this. There was a lilt in your voice. There was a moment where you stopped. There was a specific word you used that goes against what you said in the rest of the sentence. What do you think about that? I'm curious about that. That's what we talk about with speaking the truth. And Laura highlighted that as one of her strengths in bringing leadership to the Veterans Outreach Center. And the last topic we talked about in that area, which I thought was really interesting, is for her as a leader to balance moments of empathy with the people who work for her, work within the organization. So moments where there's conversation about maybe a personal aspect of the relationship, or one of the folks who works there is maybe having a struggle, either in their personal life or in how they do their work, and balancing moments where she wants to be empathic with the folks that work there, but balancing that with the fact that there are values and goals of the organization that need to be met. And that's pretty challenging. That's pretty challenging because it is a business, and it is a business that is there to serve the clientele. And so I would imagine in the role of leadership, there are moments where she would love to take much more time to be in a personal, empathic, compassionate conversation, maybe with a colleague or a coworker or someone or a direct report. And yet veterans are walking in every day. And those needs need to be met, and those needs need to be paramount. And that's really, I would imagine, one of the real challenges of leadership. I found this article, because I'm always looking for articles, entitled "The Power of Listening and Helping People Change." And I thought about this in relation to this last piece of my conversation with Laura, again, not only how she listens when she's working with veterans, but the listening that she brings to her organizational leadership. And this talks a little bit about, the article starts talking a little bit about this, our traditional, I'm the leader of an organization, I'm going to give people feedback. And so I'm quoting from the article. "One reason that giving feedback, even when it's positive, often backfires is because it signals that the boss is in charge and the boss is judgmental. This can make employees stressed and defensive, which makes it harder for them to see another person's perspective. For example, employees can handle negative feedback by downplaying the importance of the person providing the feedback or the feedback itself. People may even reshape their social networks to avoid the feedback source in order to restore their self-esteem. In other words, they defend themselves by bolstering their attitudes against the person giving feedback." And I would ask all of you to think about anywhere in your professional world where you have met with the quote, the boss, to receive feedback. Maybe it's that once a year review or some other event occurred and you're getting feedback. And one of the things I know from my work in the executive coaching world is I don't see very many examples where a leader goes to give feedback and the first thing they do is they ask a person what their experience has been with feedback. They ask a person, could you instruct me on the best way to give you feedback? They ask a person, I have some constructive feedback to give. Can I have your permission to give it to you? Are you ready? Would it be better for us to reschedule now that I've shared with you what this conversation is going to be? Very rarely is someone given feedback and then told, listen, take some time, think about it, mull it over, and then let's get back together again because I really want to hear your take on what I shared with you. Feedback in the professional working world is often delivered as this article just said. I'm giving it to you, and here's the part that I find really interesting, as the article said. If I don't want to take your feedback, I'm not gonna. Now, I might look at you and smile and say, oh, thank you, boss or supervisor. I appreciate that. I'm really going to think about this and mull it over, and I'm going to put it into my work. And the whole time I'm saying that, I'm lying to you because I feel I need to be respectful. I can't tell you what I really think. I can't tell you that there's not enough trust in the room between you and I for us to even be having this conversation. So I'll say what I need to say and I'll leave. And the entire conversation was a waste of time because I did not consider any of it. And maybe some of the feedback would have been relevant to me. And so the article goes on to talk about what it means to be a good listener. And this is so relevant in the world of organizational leadership, as well as just any of us out there who are in a helping role. And they talk about some research that the authors have done and what they found when somebody is in front of a good listener. And the article gives a bunch of definitions of what it means to be a good listener. It's a lot of what we talk about on this podcast. But what they found is that a speaker who talked to a good listener was able to walk away seeing both strengths and weaknesses more than if they were in front of what's considered a not so good listener. They were able to think more broadly. They were able to think with more flexibility when they were in front of somebody who was a good listener. Because what's good listening mean? It's honoring, it's respecting, right? It's not being distracted by a phone or a computer. Or quite honestly, it's not being distracted by your own thoughts so that you're somewhere else, even though you're physically in the room. They talked about in the article some of the enemies of good listening. And I thought this was really interesting as we think about either our role as organizational leaders, if you're in that role, or your experience with leadership. That some of the enemies are a fear of loss of power. Research has shown that some managers may feel that if they listen to their employees, they are going to be looked upon as weak. That's a fascinating statement. But at the same time, it's been shown that being a good listener means gaining prestige. So it seems managers must take a trade-off between attaining status based on intimidation and getting status based on admiration. To me, that's a no-brainer. They're really, I would argue with the authors here, there is no status based on intimidation. Intimidation is fear. Intimidation is an absolute lack of trust. So how do I engage with people in a way that creates admiration? Because admiration speaks to trust. Other things that get in the way of good listening. Listening consumes time and effort. Boy, this is huge. I was just in this conversation today. In many instances, managers listen to employees under time pressure or while they're distracted by other thoughts or work. So listening is an investment decision. Managers must put in the time to listen in order to see the future benefits. I can't tell you how many folks I've worked with who tell me that time and time and time again, appointments to meet with a supervisor are just canceled at the last minute. Right? Or rushed, or it's pretty apparent that the person I'm talking to is somewhere else in their head. And I don't mean this judgmentally to the people in the supervisory roles, because they're working in a system that fosters this. Because one of the things we know in the helping world, we talk about this all the time with really, really good coaching. Really, really good coaching, really, really good listening requires patience, and it requires time. It is not a rushed conversation. And the last item on this list that they talk about that could be an enemy to good listening is the fear of change. This I thought was really, really interesting. High-quality listening can be risky because it entails entering a speaker's perspective without trying to make judgments. This process could potentially change the listener's attitudes and perceptions. So what they're saying there is if I listen deeply, I might learn something. I might be invited to think differently. And maybe that's going to feel a little bit funky for me. So needless to say, we know the impact of really, really good, deep listening, but we know that it needs to happen in an environment that is safe and that the time is there and that people have the patience to do it and understand what the impact is, right? Over that more traditional, I run the place and I run the place through intimidation. And lastly, episode 207, helping moms and others redefine and re-engage with self-care. My guest was she's a coach, she's an author, a retreat leader. Her name is Barb Klein. She does just, every time I have a conversation with Barb, I am just so blown away by the work that she does and the perception she is able to hold on to and foster for herself and share with others about parenting and about challenging some of the notions we are all taught about what we are supposed to do as parents with our children, especially when we have children who are maybe struggling, whether it's substance use disorder, mental illness, other kinds of struggles. And so she really is someone who, and I really do view Barb as such a courageous leader in this area because she does not shy away from sharing with parents ways of thinking about parenting that upon first hearing them, many parents have no doubt say to her, "You're crazy. This isn't what parents are supposed to do." So in her work, she talks, and the majority of her work, not all, but the majority of her work is with women and in many cases moms. And she is just a powerful, powerful, passionate advocate for self-care, which as she said, for many, many women is a foreign concept. It is when you talk about the narratives and stories that we're all brought up with, that one of those stories for many, many women is you put yourself second, third, fourth, fifth, bottom of the list. And everybody that you love and care for comes before you. And so when she starts this conversation with women about self-care, many are just not even sure where to start. It creates guilt. It creates shame. It creates, I've never done that. How can I do that and still have the time and the energy and the love for the other people in my life? She frames self-care as a self-honoring process, right? That we really take good care of ourselves. And a big part of her conversation and the work that she does is that she challenges moms to rethink their boundaries and what it means to love your child. And especially if that child is maybe older, an adult child, and is a child who is struggling. What does it mean to love? Does love mean that I have to fix? Does love mean that I have to sacrifice all happiness in my life because you're not happy? Or are there some other ways that I can love you and recognize what I am truly in control of and not in control of, which is a frightening concept for us parents. I know it is for me. And redefine love, redefine good parenting. And grab onto this concept of how helpful it can be for us to stop trying to save our children and just love our children. Because Barb would make the case that we can't save. It's one of those delusions that we hold on to as parents. And that maybe we could do some things when our children were 4, we could pick them up and we can put them someplace. But when we're talking about an 18 or 19-year-old or an adult child in their 20s or 30s who's struggling, we want to. I get we want to, but we can't. We can't save them. We can't make it different, but we can love them. And one of the last things she said that so blew me away is when we're doing all of that of trying to save and your unhappiness is my unhappiness, that we're burdening our children with the responsibility of our own well-being. I've never heard it put that way. That really knocked me on my tush. Right? That our well-being, my well-being as a dad is mine. It's mine. It's my responsibility. My children are not responsible for my well-being. They're not responsible for making me feel good. And if they're struggling in their life, I can't heap another struggle onto that by somehow communicating to them that their pain is ruining my life. It's their pain, and they will have to figure out as they head into adulthood what they want to do with that. My well-being is my responsibility. So some of the skills that Barb talked about that she utilizes in her work as a coach and in the retreats that she facilitates is she called it the art of being present. She builds a lot of mindfulness practices into the work that she does, but all of them are about and she and I talked about this tendency, this kind of my words, this tendency we have as human beings to be time travelers. Right, we're in the past, we're in the present, or in the future. Very rarely do we seem to spend a whole lot of time in the present. It just seems to be really hard for us, and that is an overarching theme in her work of how do you stay in the present. And we know, the research is pretty phenomenal of the impact of mindfulness practice in helping us human beings stop our time traveling. She used this term nudging, which I really like. She talked about that she views part of her role is to nudge people towards health. And I thought that was really interesting because I wouldn't tend to say that as a coach. I would say that's not my role. It's not my role to push or do anything like that. It's my role, again, to listen deeply and create a safe space and help people explore and expand their thinking. But I like that, right? Because you could make an argument that maybe even by doing some of those kinds of helping skills, it is a bit of a nudge. It's not a push. We're not pulling them or dragging them. Just a little bit of a nudge that maybe comes with, oh, this is what a new possibility might look like. Oh, this is what difference could look like. So I dug that. I thought that was a really cool way of putting it. Barb also talked quite a bit about this concept of holding space, creating that safe space, using empathy, making herself vulnerable. And Barb is right out there with her own story that she shared in our episode of her adult child who has struggled for many years with substance use disorder and the learning that has taken place through that relationship around. And I've heard Barb say this a number of times, that even on a day when my son is not happy, isn't doing well, is struggling, that doesn't mean that can't be a day that I feel really good about things and about myself and my place in the world, right? And so that level of vulnerability that I can go there, she can go there with the people she works with, that horrible place that we sometimes find ourselves in as parents of worrying about this human being that we love with every fiber of our being. And in that love and in that connection, wanting to be able to fix and make better and control. And we can't. And if we're at all honest with ourselves, we can't. It's just not possible. And she really, really is such a powerful model for the people that she works with in how to find that space, that really difficult space of loving my child, being there to support them. Barb talked about how she attempts to support his recovery, not support his addiction, but yet finds her own places of happiness and satisfaction and fulfillment in her life separate from wherever her child happens to be at that same time. She talked a lot about curiosity, her use of curiosity, and she describes herself in her bio as a posibilitator. I love that, right? That she invites people. She invites the folks she works with to think big about themselves, to explore options, to explore maybes and what could be and might be. And I would love to check out. Not quite sure if I can make it happen, but let me at least take a look. And the last thing she talked about, which I really thought was really cool, is that she talked about inviting her clients to set an intention. And that's a wonderful helping skill to think about, because I'm sure for all of you folks out there, let me do it in a backwards way. I can think of times when I have utilized a helping person. So I've been there to get help. And this won't surprise anybody. I'm an oral processor. I can talk. And I know that one of the challenges of being a helping person in my life is that I need your help in putting some structure around where the heck I'm going with everything I'm saying. because it's just kind of like a mind and a heart dump when I've worked with helping people. And so what Barb is talking about in asking people to set an intention is she works with them relatively early on in, where do you want to go with this? What's the end result? When you get to the destination, what will that look like? So that this is not just a rambling conversation, which, again, quite honestly, for people like me, it can be. That can be the challenge I present to a helping person. I'm not the one who's going to sit there quietly and say nothing. I can talk for the entire 60 minutes on one breath, but I can also walk out and still feel all over the place. So I really wanted to honor that and highlight that of it being one of the gifts that we can give as a helping person, of putting that little bit of structure on things right from the beginning, of helping the person define a bit more specifically what they're looking to do in this specific helping conversation. So I want to thank my guests from the last 3 episodes. Again, it is just such a joy to talk with these people and to hear what they do, and that the passion that they bring. And again, my bias, the science that they bring and the thinking that they bring to doing this work. That, again, this is not just simply being a caring, compassionate, empathic, intuitive person. Those are wonderful, wonderful characteristics, prerequisite characteristics. But to carve out a long, happy, healthy, fulfilling, successful career in the helping world, we have to be willing to look at our practice and to be open to different thoughts and different modalities and different models. And what does the research say? And what are we learning about, neurochemistry and the role of behavior and the creation of trust and safety, and on and on and on. And it's one of the things I love about doing this conversation with my guests, is hearing from them what they bring to that part of their conversation, which then informs the art. Then it informs how they do it specifically, how they do it in a way that is uniquely them. And what that ends up being is a helping conversation that is truly and fully authentic. And I would argue that when we walk into the room as a helping person, what often, to go back to something we talked about earlier, what often results in the engendering of hope is that this person walks in and feels that they're in front of somebody who is truly authentic and real. And that helps them feel safe, and it helps them feel hopeful that maybe this is the helping person who's going to help me move along. So I thank you for listening and sitting in, and I look forward to being with you again as we continue to talk with people about what they do in their helping conversation. This is a powerful, intricate conversation that people are in, and I am passionate about shining a light on the skill and the talent of these individuals that invite another person into that compassionate, complex, and intimate space called the helping conversation. Everybody have a great day.
We thank you for sitting in on our discussion today on just one unique version of the helping conversation. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's podcast, so we sincerely invite you to follow, rate, and most importantly, review our episodes. For more information on Keith Greer and this podcast, log on to keithgreercoaching.com. Please join us for our next episode as we continue the exploration and celebration of the practice, art, and science of the helping conversation.